Hey everyone, it's Carissa Wiley here for ellenhudson.com. Thanks for joining me today. Today I am sharing 4 ways to use vellum on your card, and truth be told, I think there might be more than 4 ways here. But basically, we're talking all about vellum. And vellum is one of my favorite things to include on a project because it gives such an ethereal feel. And I'm going to be talking about some of the products that I use along with vellum, some techniques that you can do with vellum. And you can see my favorite vellum is right here. It's the Essentials by Ellen Heavyweight Vellum. Great vellum. Now, I'll be using all of the new July 2020 Essentials by Ellen stamp sets along with this stamp set, which is the Better Days Ahead stamp set. And this stamp set is absolutely adorable, the cute little wonky rainbow and this cute dot pattern. Now, this is a gift with purchase for a limited time at ellenhudson.com. You will get it free with a $100 purchase, and there are some restrictions, so be sure to check over there, and it is for a limited time. Now, I'm going to talk about different inks that you can use on your vellum, as well as the adhesives that I like to use. And spoiler alert, they're probably things you already have. I don't use specialty vellum adhesives. So let's talk about vellum itself. Vellum is a very, very smooth, kind of not so porous, translucent paper. And it comes in just like a plain white vellum, which is the Essentials by Ellen vellum. There are specialty vellums as well, and you can see that pearlescent vellum there on the right-hand side. That is from Lawn Fawn, and so that's a really fun thing to kind of include in your stash. It's not as heavyweight as the Essentials by Ellen vellum, so keep that in mind. Now let's talk about some ways to color vellum. And vellum, since it is not as fibrous and porous as a regular like fiber paper, I don't even know what vellum is made of, if I'm telling the truth. But I do know that it doesn't take inks as well as other papers. That doesn't mean you can't add color to it. One of the best ways to add color to vellum is an alcohol-based marker. Now, I am using Copic markers today. You could use any alcohol-based ink. You can use even Copic refills or your Ranger alcohol inks for this. But you can see I'm just scribbling these markers onto the back side of my vellum. Now that one was a little dark, so I'm taking a little bit lighter one and kind of smoothing that out. Now this gives you a very streaky look, but it dries really quickly on the surface of the vellum. And that's because alcohol evaporates more quickly than water. That's just a scientific fact. Now this can give a really cool effect, but I'm going to flip this back over. This is on the side that I've colored on, and I'm taking an alcohol prep pad. You can use alcohol in any form, really. You just need something to kind of pounce it on. And I am pouncing this alcohol prep pad on the surface that I have added the ink to. I'm kind of blotting off some of the color as I go along so that I don't mix the colors. But this is going to give me a very watercolor-like effect. So basically, this rubbing alcohol is reactivating that ink and allowing me to kind of blend it with the previous color and create a really cool watercolor effect. This is one of my favorite, all-time favorite things to do on vellum. I think it is such a beautiful effect. Now keep in mind that any color that you add to the back side of vellum is going to be a little bit lighter when you flip the vellum over. So you'll want to use a little bit darker color than you think you want. And you can see I'm holding this up here so you can see that really cool watercolor effect. Now this is a really cool, really easy technique. Anybody can do it. It's a bunch of scribbling and pouncing with alcohol. I mean, that's it. But I wanted to show you that this is really cool also on the back of this pearlescent vellum from Lawn Fawn. So I'm just taking the same colors of Copic marker again, scribbling them on once again, and then taking my alcohol prep pad and just pouncing over the surface. Now keep in mind, you can use a bottle of alcohol for this and like a paper towel or a cotton pad or something that you already have in your house. You don't have to buy alcohol prep pads. I just use alcohol prep pads in my craft room a lot more than you would think, and so I have them in the drawer next to me, so that's what I reached for. And you can see when I flip this over, you have that rainbow watercolor effect on the back of this pearlescent vellum, and it is absolutely beautiful. Now, these will curl a little bit as they are wet, but when they dry, they will flatten out. So that's one way to add color to vellum. Another way to add color to vellum is with your dye-based ink pads. Now, keep in mind, these dye-based inks have a lot of water and moisture in them, so they're not going to dry on the surface of the vellum as quickly as the alcohol ink. But that doesn't mean that you cannot use them. And so I'm just taking a couple of Catherine Pooler ink pads here. I have the It's a Girl and Coral Cabana. And you can see I'm going direct to paper with these ink pads, and I'm just swiping ink on. Now it looks like a hot mess, and it's true. It really isn't looking that great. But I'm going to show you ways to improve the look of it. So this is going to stay wet for quite a while on this vellum, and you don't want this transferring on to the other pieces of your project. So see, you can see it's on my finger there. I really don't like ink on my finger, so for me to touch that to show you, that's a big deal. So what I'm doing with this ink that is on that vellum is I'm taking a dry cloth and I'm just buffing it into the vellum. Now, it's still going to be a little bit wet where it can transfer. And I'm going to fix that with a heat tool. I have my Wow Heat embossing tool here, and I actually have it on the low setting so that I am not warping the vellum as I dry the ink into the vellum. Now, a lot of people think a dye-based ink will not dry on vellum, and that's not true. It will. It just takes a long time. So you'll want to hit it with a heat tool to speed up that drying process, but don't hit it with too much heat because you'll warp it. Now, because this ink lightens up quite a bit between the buffing and the vellum kind of muting it out, you can go in and add layers of this ink and build up that color. Remember, when you flip the vellum over, it's going to be a little bit lighter anyway because it's coming through the vellum and the vellum is kind of blurring and kind of muting it down. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the same two ink pads, I'm swiping them across the surface of the vellum again. I can gently buff in this ink into the vellum. If you don't want to buff it and you like the way that it looks, you can go ahead and just go straight to the heat tool. You don't need to do the buffing, but the buffing will help kind of blend areas together, as you can see here. Now this will definitely transfer. So what I'm doing is I'm hitting it with the heat tool to make sure all of that ink has dried on the surface of the vellum. And then I can go in and even add different shades if I want to. I decided that the pink was too much and I wanted a little orange blended in. So I'm just taking my orange pill ink pad here, swiping it across the surface. I'm going to kind of blot it and blend it into the surface of the vellum, and then once again hit it with that heat tool, and I will have a beautiful piece of colored vellum. And I've just used my ink pads for that, so you don't have to have any special tools to do this. It's a great way to make colored vellum, and this looks absolutely beautiful die cut. Now look at this over this piece of pattern paper. I mean, come on. I absolutely love the way this piece of vellum turned out. Now, I've just shown you that you can use dye-based inks on vellum, and you can also use them to stamp on vellum as well. Now, keep in mind that vellum's a little tricky sometimes with stamping because your stamp and your ink can kind of slip slide around. So what I want to do here is I have the Better Days Ahead stamp set. I have the largest bow of this rainbow, and I'm going to stamp it onto the vellum. But look at what I'm doing. I'm not adding a ton of pressure here. I'm setting it onto the vellum, and then I am gently pressing. If you press hard, that stamp is going to go slip sliding across the surface of the vellum. So when you are stamping on vellum, you want to make sure that you're using light pressure. I know it's hard for me too. I tend to be a really heavy-handed person, and so I have to really kind of slow myself down. You could also use a MISTI tool for that. Now you can see this ink is very wet. If I run my finger through it, it's gonna smear. So I'm gonna set it with my heat tool, and that will help that ink dry a whole lot faster on the surface of the vellum, and it will prevent someone who is a klutz like me from smearing that ink. Now, once I've set it with the heat tool, I like to flip the inked side over onto a piece of scrap paper and kind of blot it off to make sure there's no ink transfer. And then once I've done that, I can continue on with my stamping. Now, I'm going to do the rest of my stamping here. I am not heat setting between each of these colors, but you you could absolutely stop at every step and heat set, but I decided to go ahead and just complete the stamping and then hit it with the heat tool. And once again, I'm going to flip that ink side over onto my scrap piece of paper and blot it off to make sure that I have no ink transfer. Then I know it's completely dry. And so now I have this really adorable wonky rainbow stamped onto my vellum. And the only additional step that I did to kind of stamp on this vellum is heat set in between those color layers. So we've added a faux watercolor effect, we've added color with our dye-based ink pads, we've stamped on vellum. Now let's talk about embossing on vellum. I'm gonna add this little polka dotty kind of detail layer that comes in the Better Days Ahead stamp set. And in order to emboss successfully on vellum, you're gonna wanna do a couple of things. Number one, you're gonna wanna prep it with a powder tool. And I mean prep it with a powder tool, because vellum is known for static and holding on to things that you don't want it to. Now, once I've done that, I've stamped my detail layer here in the Versamark ink, and I've added my gilded embossing powder. And then there were a couple of areas that I had to clean up with a dry paintbrush to get some of the extra embossing powder. Now you're going to notice when I turn on my heat tool, I'm turning it to the higher setting, the number 2 setting, which is the higher setting. And I allowed it to warm up. I mean, get hot. And once it's at full heat, then you can take it to the vellum in short bursts from a distance and melt that embossing powder. And that's gonna help minimize warping on the vellum. Now you may get some warping on your vellum, even doing all of these things. There are things that you can do to mitigate that. So you can put it in like a heavy book to kind of flatten it out. You see I have a little bit of warping there. You could run it through your die cut machine with no dye to kind of help flatten it out. But all of those things put together will help kind of minimize the warping. So I'm going to emboss again. I've prepped the surface of my vellum with my powder tool, and you can see I've taken this off of the scrap piece of paper to stamp the sentiment, because I can use the grid that's on my work surface to make sure that I get my sentiment stamped straight on this card front. That's wonderful thing about vellum, is that you can see through it. It also can work against you in certain ways, like with adhesive, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. But I've prepped the surface, I stamped my sentiment using Versamark ink, added my gold embossing powder, and then heat set it in short bursts. Now this is looking really adorable. I wanted to add a couple of really fun embossed lines. When you add some scoring lines on vellum, it really makes it pop and has like this really white effect on it. So I just put it into my scoring tool and added some score lines around all 4 edges. And now I am taking this abstract paint stroke and stamping it where that greeting is so that it has a little color behind it. And then I'm going to take this kind of, splatter. I don't know what you would call this kind of design on the stamp, but it's also from the abstract paint stroke stamp set, which is one of my favorites. And I'm stamping that behind this little cluster or grouping of stamped and die cut images here. You can see I added a die cut vellum cloud, a few sequins, and then I have that pattern kind of showing through, which looks like raindrops. And for this card, I just added my vellum on with a decorative piece of washi tape along the top. So that's one way you can adhere vellum. Now let's move on to card number 2. I am taking this floral cluster. This is from the You Should Know stamp set. It's brand new from the Essentials by Ellen line. And I am going to white heat emboss on top of the vellum. So I've prepped the surface using my powder tool. I did stamp in the Misty, which gives you a little more control when you're stamping on vellum. And then I'm going to heat set this on the vellum. Now I'm going to cut this out so I'm not too concerned about warping. So I did leave my heat tool on the vellum for a little bit longer than you would if you were going to use this as a panel. And I flipped this over to the back side. So this is the side that I did not emboss. The embossing's facing towards the table. And I'm using my Copic markers to quickly add just a little bit of color to these flowers and a few of the leaves. And then I'm going to take my scissors and fussy cut these out. Now these stamp sets do not have coordinating dies, but these flowers are really easy to fussy cut. I'm using my favorite fussy cutting scissors. These are the EK Success little scissors, and I'm just making sure that I keep the scissors kind of still and move the paper around. Now to finish off this card, I am actually going to adhere these flowers on with foam adhesive, regular old white foam adhesive. Now, I find that if you're using a large area of white on the background of your card, so if you're using like a white card base or something, then you can absolutely use this foam adhesive. It blends right in with the white cardstock. You can hardly see it. So that is one of my tricks to using vellum, is that if I just adhere it on white, I can use foam adhesive and you don't even see it. The other thing that's helping me in this situation is that I have white embossing lines, which I can use to kind of disguise some of that foam adhesive. And I have a little bit of color on the back side of that vellum. So all of those things working together means that I can adhere these pieces onto my card front and you can't even see that foam adhesive. Now you can see I've just added my little floral cluster to this card that has a little bit of the Modern Graphics paper pack from the Essentials by Ellen line, a heat embossed sentiment, and a couple of these hexagon frames that I have die cut using some gold cardstock, and I'm just going to trim off the excess. And I added those hexagon pieces on with a little bit of liquid adhesive, and I will finish this off with some sparkling clear sequins, and that is my second card featuring vellum. Let's move on to the third card. Now for this card, I am using that piece of rainbow watercolor vellum that I created earlier and the Thank You for Being a Friend stamp set. This is brand new from the Essentials by Ellen line, and it always makes me think of thank you for being a friend. You know that song, right? It was from a TV show, right? What TV show was it from? I have no idea. Anyway, I am heat embossing this sentiment onto the front side of this watercolor. Remember, the color is actually on the back side, using some white embossing powder. And then I am going to take one of the essential rectangles from the Essentials by Ellen line, and I'm going to die cut this. And I'm going to use the outer portion of this and this inner portion, and the little tiny delicate frame that this essential rectangle creates, that one that's still on the cutting pad there, I'm going to set that aside for my next project. Now here is my next groundbreaking adhering vellum technique, and it is just a little bit of liquid glue with teeny tiny dots. So I'm adding this liquid glue onto this outer frame that I'm using, and I'm just putting tiny dots all over the back. I'm trying to concentrate it in areas where there's color. I'm putting it on the very corners because I want those to stick down. And then I'm going to adhere it onto my card base. And guess what? You can't even see the adhesive. So what I'm telling you in all of this is there are ways to use the adhesives that you already have in your stash to adhere vellum, and it's actually quite easy. It's just a matter of kind of disguising and using it in small amounts. So now I'm taking a piece of this pattern paper from the Modern Graphics paper pad, and I am adding this center heat embossed portion with some foam adhesive. Once again, I am using that embossing to my advantage, and this little area where I have that sentiment strip adhered down to disguise the foam adhesive that I'm using to adhere this panel. So I think hiding that adhesive behind that sentiment strip really helps as well. You can see I added a little heart there and some sparkling clear sequins, and that finishes off my third card. Now this fourth card is really simple, especially when you have beautiful graphic floral images like this Mondo Pansy that's brand new. I'm just stamping this in Gina K Obsidian Amalgam ink onto my card base. This is actually the card base. This is about as one layer as I do for cards. And then I'm taking that really thin little frame that I die cut earlier from that watercolor vellum panel, and I am going to add some liquid adhesive on that and adhere it onto my card base. And I'm going to finish this off with a couple of die cut tags and an embossed sentiment and a little bit of twine. It is so easy, but this card turned out so beautiful. I think it is one of my favorites, and I think it's probably because of that really big graphic black and white floral image. So there you have it, 4 ways, or maybe even more, to use vellum on your cards. I hope you enjoyed these card projects today featuring the brand new Essentials by Ellen release for July 2020. And don't forget about the Better Days Ahead stamp set that you can get as a gift with purchase. now through July 19th, 2020. And for more information on that, be sure to check the ellenhudson.com blog. You'll find a link to that in the description below, as well as links to the featured products used in these projects. As always, thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed these projects, and I hope you were inspired to incorporate vellum on your next card project. If you do, be sure to tag us on social media so that we can check it out. You can use hashtag Essentials by Ellen to show us your projects that you create using the Essentials by Ellen stamps and dies. Thanks again for joining me and hanging out with me today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn on the notifications so you won't miss any of our paper crafting and card making video tutorials. We have tons of inspiration here. Have an amazing summer, and until next time, I hope you have a fabulous day.